Politics is an interesting thing, as you all know. We are involved in a very heated and interesting campaign at this point, and sometimes when we look at it, we think that politics is chaotic, it's random, things happen that nobody expects to happen, and they can change things on a dime, things like this. You know, the other night in the debate, Joe the plumber, who would have believed that there would be a character who could emerge in the middle of a campaign like that. But actually, political science and history, American history, suggests that politics really isn't that chaotic. It isn't really that random, that there are patterns that if you look at our history and our and the way the political processes work, that there are patterns that have occurred. And one of the patterns that occurs is that we have periods in American history, and I'd like to say that I can take credit for this, but I can't. I can't take any credit for this whole notion of political patterns, of realignments, things of this nature. Those were actually the intellectual discovery of a political scientist who has since departed, a guy named V.O. Key, who was old when I was young and writing about this thing, that America goes through cycles. And these cycles usually involve a situation where one political party dominates the political process for a period of approximately 40 years, wins most of the presidential elections in that period of time. In fact, historically, if you go back, that's what this chart suggests, that during these periods of time, and we've been through 5 of them in our history at this point, one party wins about 3/4 of the presidential elections contested during that period. And so you can see on the far left-hand side, 1828 to 1856, that was a Democratic era. We decided to use, for the purpose of this PowerPoint, the famous red state, blue state analogy. So the blue bars are periods where the Democrats have been dominant, the red bars are periods where the Republicans have been dominant. And you can see that you just look at it, that again, one party has won 3/4 of the presidential elections, contested during that period, generally controlled Congress during much of that period, and has pretty much dominated the political process. That's something that V.O. Key, maybe even the Arthur Schlesingers before him, had noted, a pattern that exists throughout American political history. But where I think Morley and I were able to take this further is to try to explain why this pattern occurs, what makes these periods exist, these periods of stability exist, what makes them change. And so basically, here's our picture. In American politics, we have 4 decades of electoral stability. One party tends to win most of the elections. They tend to dominate the public policy that is conducted during a particular period. We don't see much change in the type of public policy for these periods of 40 years. We see a situation where one party dominates in terms of party identification. That's a notion that most everybody has a sense that they're either Democrats or Republicans or independents, and the distribution of party identification during one of these periods of stability is pretty much stable. So from the 1930s to the 1960s, late 1960s, about 50–55% of the public thought of themselves as Democrats, 30 to 35, maybe 40% Republicans, and the rest independents. After 1968, it began to change, so that during the 1980s, 1990s, into the early 2000s, early part of this decade, it was roughly a 50–50 split, about about a third Democrats, a third Republicans, a third independents. So, but during these periods, there is stability. Voting coalitions remain the same. Again, going back to the red state, blue state analogy, if I were to mention the names of states to you, you could decide, you could pretty much know whether they be red states or blue states. If I'd say California or New York or Massachusetts, you'd say, oh, those are blue states. The Democrats win those states almost all the time. If I were to say Kentucky or West Virginia, well, not so much West Virginia, but Kentucky, Mississippi, Utah, Idaho, those are definitely red states. The Republicans win those. Those remain stable throughout entire periods. Policy remains the same. But suddenly a shift occurs. And this is, I think, what Morley and I were able to contribute to this. The shift occurs, we have 40 years of stability. In an election cycle or 2, all of it changes, goes very quickly. So we believe 2008 is going to be the first year of this change. 2012 will be the ratifying of this. What causes these big changes? What causes this sudden shift to end this period of stability? And our argument is that it is the coming of age of a large, dynamic generation. A new generation comes along that is large. It has to be large because it can overwhelm all the other generations that have come of age before it. And it has to be dynamic. Not all generations are outgoing. Some generations are outgoing. Strauss and Howell spoke of 4 different generational archetypes, 2 of which are outgoing. They try to change society in one way or another. The other 2 are more inwardly focused. They are more concerned with their own internal concerns, their own internal personal needs. So a new, large, dynamic generation comes along. Generations, by the way, are approximately 20 years, 25 years in length. And so we have this 80-year cycle for all 4 generations going through American history that Strauss now talked about. But a new, large, dynamic generation comes along. Not all generations are the same size either, due to birth rates, differences in birth rates, differences in immigration, things of this nature. So some generations are bigger, some generations are smaller. But it's the large, dynamic generations that cause the change. And the emergence of a new communication technology that can be used to mobilize the new generation, and Morley will talk about this in detail in a little while, but this particular technology that's coming around now, that's being used now, is not only used to mobilize the generation, but the generation itself is using it to mobilize itself. So it's a very different kind of situation. But in the 1930s, it was radio. In the 1960s, the last realignment, it was television, and now it's the internet-based, the web-based social networking technology, which is revolutionizing the political process. Again, what you see is a change in electoral results, voting behavior, public policy. It all changes during these periods of realignment, and then we go back to another 40 years of stability, and the next realignment occurs, driven by a new generation and a new technology. Again, we know that this is going to happen because, as Strauss and Howell pointed out, we have this cyclical situation where we have these 4 generational types that recur throughout American history, and we know that we are at a point in our history where a new generation, a new large generation, is rising, it's emerging, and it's ready to change the process. So let's talk a little bit about the generations, the 4 generational types. The oldest generation of Americans, where there are large numbers of Americans, are still, as Morley and Marilyn mentioned, some remaining members of the GI generation who are very elderly at this point. But for the most part, the oldest generation, where there are large numbers of Americans still living, is the silent generation. Silent generation were people who were born from 1925 to 1945. Now think about those years, what was going on in American history at that point, what was going on in the country at that point. It was the Depression, World War II, so a time of great stress. And as a result, members of the silent generation, again, these are generalizations, they're not every single person is like that, but as a generational type, people are like that, were overprotected and smothered as children. It's how people are reared that shapes their adult behavior. And so this generational type, a lot of it because of what was going on in the world, were overprotected and smothered as children. And as a result, this generational type became risk averse, kind of conformist. They were inclined toward compromise as adults. They tried to bring other people together. One thing is interesting about this generation is that it has never elected a president yet. It's the only generation in American history that has not elected a president. One of the candidates for office this year for the presidency is a member of the silent generation, and I'm sure you know which one that is. And the Democratic candidate for vice president, Joe Biden, is also a member of the silent generation. So one way or another, for the first time in our history, there will either be a president or a vice president from the silent generation.